On today's episode, we tackle how to methodically pick out those dreaded backlashes. The 9 new anglers for the 2025 Bassmater Elite Series season are decided, and we tackle some listener questions about wind, rod eyelet failure, false spawns, and attending the Bassmater Classic for the first time. All that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Welcome to the Tackle Talk Podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. World-class fishing gear, unmatched personal service. Now, here's your host, Andrew Hayes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Tackle Talk Podcast. As always, we are brought to you by the great folks over at American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. And you guys know, American Legacy Fishing is my favorite place to shop for tackle, and it is now a lot of yours too, because you've got to experience the American Legacy Fishing difference. They have the selection of a lot of these big websites, but they treat you like the small mom and pop tackle shop right down the street. You really get the best of both worlds when you shop with ALF. And not only do they have great deals on brand new rods, reels, line, baits, apparel, they also have the internet's biggest selection of lightly used fishing gear. And right now, they have an overstock sale going on the website where you can save up to 50% off select items from Jackal, Daiwa, Bahio, Waterland Sunglasses, Shimano, G. Loomis, Berkeley, and more. All you got to do, go to the American Legacy Fishing Facebook page. It's just under American Legacy Fishing Company, LLC. If you click there, scroll down about 3 or 4 posts, and you're going to see a post with the link to that overstock sale. Click that link, and you're going to be really pleasantly surprised with some of the deals they have going on right now over at American Legacy Fishing. If you're in the market for sunglasses, if you're in the market for a brand new reel, maybe like an Abu Garcia Xenon, they have some killer deals on those. They have some awesome deals on Max Scent soft plastics going on right now. They have Daiwa Samurai marked way down if you need some new fluoro. Daiwa Legalises at $79. A Garmin Striker 4 Vivid CV if you're looking for a small lightweight fish finder for like a kayak, $134 right now. Jackal Bounty Fish and Drift Fryer on sale. All that and more over at AmericanLegacyFishing.com. And as always, you can use code TackleTalk10. Tackle Talk 10 saves you 10% off almost everything on the website over at www.americanlegacyfishing.com. All right, everybody. The first thing we're going to talk about here really quickly today is we're going to start with some pretty big news from the professional bass fishing world. Specifically, we now know the 9 new Bassmater Elite Series qualifiers for next season, which should be your brand new upcoming rookie class. Now, I say should be because obviously barring anything weird happening or any of them dropping out or not opting into the Elite Series next year, which I don't know why you would do that if you committed to all this time and effort and money to fish all 9 opens, then you should be entering the Bassmater Elite Series next year, I would assume. And these new group of 9 rookies are who we're going to be watching for the next calendar year. So these 9 guys fished all 9 Bassmater Opens this season in hopes of finishing in the top 9 overall, which earns you a spot on next year's Bassmater Elite Series season, the highest level of professional bass fishing on the Bassmaster side of things. So who are they? Let's meet these 9 anglers. So I'm going to go in the order in which they qualified, with number 1 going first, all the way down to number 9. So your first qualifier for the Elite Series next season is Easton Fothergill, a guy who has won an Open this past year at Leech Lake. He's been one of the top college anglers in the country over the past few years. He won the 2023 Bassmater College Classic bracket at Milford Lake. He's already a 2-time Bassmater Classic qualifier, and overall, just a very impressive young man with a stout resume already, and that's before he even steps foot in the Elite Series next season. So Easton is for sure a name that we're going to want to watch come 2025. The second angler to qualify this season is Cody Meyer, Another familiar face for you bass fishing fans, Cody spent the last 5 years before this year on the Major League Fishing Bass Pro Tour, where he racked up 4 top 10s and 3 Red Crest appearances before going through the Opens this year in 2024 to try and qualify for the Bassmater Elite Series. So that's your number 2 angler. Number 3 next year is going to be Tucker Smith. Again, a name that fans might recognize, the former partner of current Elite Series angler Logan Parks when they won $1 million in the Bass Pro Shops U.S. Open a few years back. He's also a 2-time college champ, a 3-time high school champ, another young gun that a lot of people have had on their radar for the past few years, and it's no surprise that he qualifies for bass fishing's biggest stage this year. So your other 6 are going to be number 4, Paul Marks, number 5, Emil Wagner, number 6, Andrew Loberg, number 7, Dakota Ebert, number 8, Bo Browning, and number 9, Evan Kung. So all of those names are fairly new to me, with the exception of Dakota Ebert, who spent 2022 and 2023 on the Major League Fishing Bass Pro Tour as well. He's had 2 wins over his career, 1 on the Toyota Series level and 1 on the Tackle Warehouse Invitational circuit, I think. But overall, those are your 9 Bassmaster Elite Series qualifiers for next year. Easton Fothergill, Cody Meyer, Tucker Smith, Paul Marks, Emil Wagner, Andrew Loberg, Dakota Ebert, Bo Browning, and Evan Kung. So those are names that we're going to want to get familiar with, as those will likely be your rookies next year on the Elite Series. Okay, everybody, next up here, fairly quickly, I want to take some time today to go over something that plagues so many of us. We get emails and mailbag questions about it pretty frequently, so I just want to take some time today to talk about it in hopes of helping some people out there that might deal with this often and have a little bit more pleasant experience on the water when it does happen, and that thing is backlashes. So the dreaded bird's nest, the backlash, the rat's nest, whatever you call it, there are probably some curse words in pretty close proximity to it whenever you mention it out loud. One of the most frustrating things that an angler can experience out on the water is you see your spot, you're making your cast, and then for one reason or another, it could be wind, it could be hitting something in your back cast, user error, whatever it is, boom, your lure stops halfway through your cast, and you look down and the spool on your bait caster has doubled in size with tangled, unruly fishing line. It is the dreaded backlash. And some people look at that backlash, they try for a few minutes, and then they give up when it doesn't come out very easily, and they either reach for another rod or they cut that line out, which means you're going to have to respool, which is both time-consuming and expensive. And sometimes, in very extreme circumstances, that may be your only option. But again, those are very extreme cases. Most of the time, those backlashes are able to be removed. It just takes the right technique to do it. So that's what we're going to talk about here today, how to effectively remove backlashes without damaging your line. So let's first start with what you don't do. The number one thing you don't do is pull hard on that line in the hopes that it will just completely come out if you pull as hard as you can and just try and rip it out. That can only do 2 things. That can break your line or it can make it worse, neither of which you obviously want to do. Breaking your line is self-explanatory. If you bird nest and your line is all tangled and jammed up there, and if you just try and yank it out, especially with lighter line, if the force of you pulling on that line is greater than the strength of that line, it's going to snap, obviously. Then, if it snaps inside that ball of that bird nest you have, you're done, because good luck. Even if you do find that tag end, it could have gone under or overlapped things in there, wherever that little tag end is, and the method that we're going to talk about today probably won't work at that point. Or if it doesn't break, it's just going to make it worse because you're pulling so hard, you're going to have that line dig into itself, into that spool, and it's going to be tighter and tighter, which you also don't want to do. 1, again, it's going to make it harder to get out. 2, you can damage your line because you're just burning that line into itself as you pull harder and harder. So don't just try and yank it out. That very, very rarely works in your favor. Instead, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to stay calm, stay gentle, and almost take more of like a puzzle approach to this. most of the time, there is a simple, methodical way to pick out a bird's nest. So first, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your normal hand, whatever hand that you normally thumb that spool with, and put that thumb right on that spool and gently apply pressure while you grab your line coming out of your reel's line guide, like where your line normally comes out of your reel, and gently pull up until you reach a point where that line stops coming out. At that point, you've reached your first obstacle to fix this bird's nest. When you get to a point where your line stops coming out, keep that tension a little tight and look at where that line meets back on your spool, where it's coming through your line guide and joins the rest of that line on that spool. Where that line first comes off that spool, you're likely going to see a piece or two of line going over that main line. It's overlapping that main piece of line that you're trying to pull out, and it's really stopping it from going any farther. So you want to identify those one or two pieces that are going over and overlapping your main line. Just give it like a little jiggle or a pull and then release it. Again, do the same thing, a little jiggle, pull, and release it. And you're going to see what I call loops. That's probably what I'm going to refer to them as for the rest of this episode. Loops. Those are those small pieces of line that are overlapping the strand of line that you're trying to pull out of the reel. And it's keeping it from going any further. They almost work like a seat belt for your line that keep you from being able to pull that line off that spool. And then when you do pull them out, they kind of come up to the top a little bit and they make almost like a U or a V across your line. Those loops, whether it's 1, 2, 3, however many there are over that line you're trying to pull off, those are what need to be fixed. So what you're going to do is you're going to pull your line semi-tight. You're going to find that loop, that part that goes over and is really restricting you from pulling any farther, and then loosen your line a little bit so that loop raises just a tad from that pressure being released, and then pull up on that loop. Literally take your fingers, like your thumb and your index finger, and pinch that little loop and pull it up. Don't pull the line that you're trying to pull off your reel. Pull that loop and pull it up and pull it straight up out of the reel, and then try and pull your main line again and see if it starts to come out again. If it does, congratulations, you've fixed your first loop, and now you can start pulling that line out again to get that bird's nest out. Again, light pressure with your one thumb and really just slowly pull out. And what you're probably going to find, you're going to run into this situation again and again and again. So that is the first methodical approach to this, is actually finding those individual loops, pulling them up, and then pulling your regular line back out at the same time to try and get it to free up. Because the reason that you're hitting that jam and that line's not coming out any farther is those loops restricting it from being pulled out. Those are the things that you need to fix, and it can be just as simple as that. Now, if you do pull that loop up and then you pull your line out again and it stops at that exact same loop, well, then that loop now has a loop. So this is where you kind of go down the sort of chain here to try and fix the actual root of the problem, is pull that loop up, and if that doesn't free your main line to really pull out and kind of get this bird's nest out, well, then pull that loop all the way up until it stops. And then once it stops, what you're going to see is that loop has a loop. Wherever that line stops, you're going to see another one or two pieces of line over that piece of line, obstructing it from being pulled any farther. So then you know what you're going to do next. You're going to pick and pull that loop up, and you're going to keep doing this until you hit a point where it's not restricted anymore. That's what you're going to do. Those secondary and third and fourth and fifth loops, whether it's on your main line or whether your loops have loops. I know this is like a weird thing to try and explain in a podcast with no visuals, but it really is that simple. It's a methodical way to get that backlash out. The reason that your line stops coming out there is not because of some Rubik's Cube, 4D chess problem in your reel. 99% of the time, I feel like it's just these individual loops that you need to pull out. So as long as you don't panic and you don't pull it too tight, you don't cinch all of that line down too tight at the beginning, you can almost always get them out. It's the same thing as when you get snagged with a jig. If you get snagged and you feel that snag real early and you don't set the hook like a maniac because you think it's it's a fish, or you don't try and rip that jig out. If you really just stop, you feel the resistance, you feel that it's kind of snagged, and you stop, then you can usually get that jig out. You can do the little line snap trick. You can do the, send the rod down your line trick. I don't recommend that because you're going to break your rod, but there's all kinds of things you can do. Give it a wiggle, give it a pop, do the line snap thing, and a lot of times you can get that jig out because you didn't panic and you didn't bury that jig into that log. It's just kind of hung up on the other side. It's the same thing with backlashes. As long as you don't do something stupid at the very beginning, usually you can get them out, again, with this sort of easy, methodical approach at find the loop, pick it out. Find the loop, pick it out. It's a chain reaction, and you're almost always going to get that backlash out. I'm probably 95 to 97% over my lifetime getting backlashes out of reels with this method. Now, there are some other tricks too, like if your backlash is super fluffy and you can't make any progress on it because it's so blown up, there's something you can do where you can take your thumb and kind of push down on all of that excess line and then give it like a, quarter or a half turn or so. And you can almost use your thumb as like a squeegee for that line to kind of help free up some of those loops and get you a place to get started to the point where it's a little bit more compact and manageable again in a better position. I don't really do that a whole lot of times though, because the thing that you need to keep in mind with that is that you can do that with braid, because braid, it's not too much of an issue if you kink the heck out of that braid. It doesn't matter. Braid can be kinked all over the place. You're not going to really ruin it. But with something like fluoro or mono, you have to be careful through that whole process, especially the little thumb squeegee thing, which I don't normally do, because if you kink that line now has a weak spot. That's why I'm not a huge fan of doing the thumb thing, because when you flatten that line, anywhere where you have a loop or you have overlap or you have a bend already, you're going to make that worse. You're going to kink that line even more, and any kink is now the glaring weak spot in your line, especially fluoro, mono 2. You can feel that kink forever when you run your fingers over it. That's now a weak spot in your line that you don't want there. So the point of this whole episode and these backlash surgery type things here is to fix and extend the life of the line, not damage it. So I'm not a big fan of that. There are some guys that will tell you, hey, yeah, you got to do this, like push down really lightly, give it a quarter turn or half turn or something, and almost like push that line down and help get some backlashes out. That's not really my thing. But another thing that you want to be mindful of and you want to keep in mind as you pick out these backlashes is where your excess line is laying. If you're on a boat or you're in a kayak, I try and make sure that my line is landing in the water. But then you have to be cognizant about the water that you're in. You got to make sure that you're not in water that has current that's like carrying that excess line back to, like, say, your trolling motor or your outboard motor. Because then not only do you have a bird's nest, now you've got your excess line wrapped up in your motor. Again, also not good. So you want to make sure you have that line that you're pulling out when you're detangling this and you're picking out those loops. That line that you're pulling out, that kind of slack line, you want to make sure that's sitting in some really calm, simple area where it's not going to tangle itself too. So you want to make sure that it's not landing in like a bush or twigs or a place where the wind is ripping around. You want that excess line to be laid safe, flat, and calm so that you don't fix your backlash just to start reeling in and realize you have a whole nother problem of knots in that slack line that you laid down on the ground. Now, the one thing that I might recommend getting in terms of like some sort of tool to help you pick these loops out, especially if you have big fingers or completely non-existent fingernails, sometimes it can be tough to actually get a pinch on that loop and pull up. So for that, if you're looking for an actual tool, I think I have found the cheapest option in the world for this. And it comes to us, no surprise, from Harbor Freight. So you guys know I love Harbor Freight. I am a cheapskate. I buy all kinds of cheap stuff. I realize it's not going to last 50 years and be handed down to my grandchildren or something. This is not going to be an heirloom tool by any means, but it's going to be cheap and it's going to do the job. So at Harbor Freight, they have what they call a 4-piece mini pick and hook set, and it's $1.99. So you got to love it. There are 4 pieces in this kit, like 50 cents a tool, $1.99, and now you've got a few tools to help you get under that first loop to start pulling it up. Now, I wouldn't use these to actually pull the whole loop up once you get some room down there. You are going to want to use your finger because I don't want to use a metal tool on fluoro or mono or braid and really pull it up because you've got the chance, obviously, to damage your line by doing that. So instead, I don't use this sharp metal tool to actually pick out the whole backlash. I just use it if I'm having trouble getting a grip on that loop to be able to start pulling up. I'll use this to kind of put some little slack in that loop so that my fingers can grab it. In that instance, it can be a very handy little tool. Again, very well worth the 50 cents per tool that you're going to spend on this thing to like keep one in your boat or your kayak or your backpack. But other than that, to me, getting out a backlash effectively is usually as simple as pulling semi-tight, finding the obstructing, overlapping loop on that spool, pulling on that loop until it stops pulling, then finding that loop's loop if you need to, pulling up on that, and repeating the process until the line starts coming back out of my reel again. Stay calm, take a simple, methodical approach to your backlashes, and you should be able to get most of them out. And if you can't, unfortunately, you all know the drill, cut and respool, but I try to avoid that as much as possible because, like everything else in the world today, line is expensive. All right, everybody, we'll get back to the episode here in just a second, but first we are brought to you in part by Dakota Lithium Batteries, and I'm really excited right now. I'm packing up the batteries, I'm packing up everything, and we're going to take an out-of-state trip to Pennsylvania this weekend. Very, very excited for that, but I wouldn't be able to do this trip without Dakota Lithium and those batteries in my kayak. We're going to cover a lot of water. My poor motor is going to get beat to snot this weekend. My electronics are going to be working overdrive, and I know I am going to need a lot of juice, and I love that the one thing I don't ever have to worry about is my batteries. That's because I run Dakota Lithiums. So many of you listening now run Dakota Lithiums too. It's so nice just to not have that headache of worrying about your power source. They're twice the power of traditional batteries at half the weight, charge up to 5 times faster, last up to 4 times longer, 100% US-based customer support, and they come with an 11-year warranty. And if you want your own Dakota Lithium batteries, all you got to do, go to www.dakotalithium.com and use code TACKLETALK5. Tackle Talk, the number 5, saves you 5% off your entire battery purchase, and it lets Dakota Lithium know that we here at Tackle Talk sent you. It's a win-win, so head over to www.dakotalithium.com, use code TACKLETALK5, run the best with Dakota Lithium, the official lithium battery of Bassmaster. All right, everybody, that is enough backlash talk. It is now our favorite time of the week. Let's open up the Tackle Talk podcast mailbag powered by Dakota Lithium.
This is the Tackle Talk podcast mailbag, powered by Dakota Lithium Batteries. Adventure awaits at dakotalithium.com.
All right, our first question here is from Colton, and he says, "Hey, Andrew, I've got a question for you. My lake is in the middle of the turnover right now, and on multiple occasions, I've seen some tank largemouth from the boat just cruising the shallows. I've tried pitching finesse baits around these fish, but they show no interest. Now, I'm not asking how to catch them, as that answer hangs on so many different variables. However, I'm wondering if you've personally ever had any success with these types of fish, and if so, what's the story? Thanks." Hey, Colton, great question. And ironically enough, I haven't run into this too much this year, but my buddy Jeff texted me about probably a week and a half, 2 weeks ago now. And he said that he was at a big public reservoir. I'm not going to name it because we try not to spot burn places, but a place close to where we grew up, a place we're very familiar with. And he said he saw like 4 or 5 huge largemouth cruising the top of the water, exactly as you're describing, except it wasn't in the shallows. His was over 20 feet of water. So these fish were doing exactly what you were saying, just obviously over very, very deep, clear water, which was even weirder. But they were just hanging out at the very top of the water column, kind of moseying around, not doing anything in particular. And in that situation, yeah, I guess you could probably chalk that up to turnover. That's a deep reservoir. It just turned over. Those fish are probably thrown out of whack for a few days because their whole world just got shook up. But for you, you said it was in the shallows. And I think, and I don't know for sure because I don't know where you're at, I don't know your water temps, I don't know any of that kind of thing, but that could be another phenomenon. To me, your situation sounds more like a false spawn. So we get that around here sometimes. I don't see it too often, but I did have someone the other day that caught a fish that was trying to spawn around here. So I know it is happening around here too. Some fish just get confused when that water temp gets down in like the low 60s. There's some weird moon stuff going on probably those couple days, and those fish just get confused and they start to exhibit spawning behaviors. Males will start to move up and cruise the shallows. They'll even start making beds sometimes. Now, they're not actually going to go through the whole process and spawn in the fall in places like Ohio or, probably wherever you're at too, but their biological calendar is just a little messed up for a second because the temperature feels right, the situation feels right. They're like, wait a second, this feels like we should be doing the thing right now. And then, a couple days pass, the temp starts going down and they start realizing, oh, just kidding. That was a false alarm there. This is not the time to do that. But that could be what you saw, right? Just more of like a false spawn situation, a couple males or something moving up shallow and starting to maybe fan some beds or something because they just got a little thrown off because of the weather and the water temps and all that kind of stuff. That definitely could be the situation too. That would probably be my best guess. All right, the next question is from John, and he says, hey, Andrew, longtime listener here. I want to know about wind when it's windy, especially if it's 6 miles per hour or over. What should I be throwing? Is top water out of the equation? And then parentheses, he says, in my mind, I feel like it is. And where should I be fishing? Should I be fishing on the windy side of my lake, or should I be fishing on the calm water where the wind is coming from? Should I be shallow or deep, or does time of year still stand strong? Wind just throws me all off and can ruin my game plan I have when I get to the lake and it's 8, 9, or 10 miles per hour. Thanks a lot, John. Hey, John, good question there too. I will try to make sure my answer isn't too long-winded. But really here, in all seriousness, here are some very simple answers, hopefully, to these questions. First question, is top water out of the equation when the wind is 6 miles per hour or above? My answer to that is going to be HE double hockey sticks. No, it's not. It is definitely not out of the equation. And in some situations, it might actually be the whole equation. Now, when the wind starts whipping, your first move, which I'm assuming might be your thought process to actually ruling out top water altogether, is to consider the fact that the water is chopped, which means that your top water and the commotion that it's normally making is not as noticeable as it would be if it was flat calm. And that can be true. So in that case, you might want to reach for a more dramatic top water, like a buzz bait or a big knock-in spook or a crawler or something like that, because you're right, maybe a finesse popper loses a little bit of its oomph in high winds. Even though that doesn't mean that it can't get bit, it just means that the water displacement is a little bit more subtle by comparison to the wind. So that's always something for sure. I get kind of like that a little bit too. I was like that when I was real young, where I was basically just convinced that you couldn't throw top water in the rain, because if I've got a popper over here that's spitting water, but the entire top of the water is spitting water because there's raindrops hitting it, then yeah, why would they recognize my popper? I used to think like that. Now, I obviously don't. I've caught a ton of fish on top water in the rain, and I've just kind of debunked that. But back in the day, that was my thought process. They're not going to notice my top water because the entire top of the water right now is blowing up and making weird ripples and sounds and water's hitting it, and they're not going to even think about hitting my top water. Not the case. Same thing with wind. But on the flip side, the wind sometimes stirs up the overall activity of those fish on the wind-blown side of your lake. Wind blows the microorganisms that direction, then the bait fish follow, then the bass follow. It's simple food chain there. So is the area where the wind is whipping worth fishing? That's the second answer to your question. Yes, it definitely is. The wind-blown side of the lake, I think, is always at least worthy of your attention. Now, for me, there is going to be a line that I have to draw at some point. And there's a lot of factors that go into this, but the bottom line is the wind bad enough that I cannot fish that area safely and effectively? If the wind is too bad to fish safely and effectively, then you might try and find an area near where the wind picks up, where it's still calm enough for you to manage, but you're not in the complete dead calm side of the lake. You're at least near where the action's going on while being safe. And this is a little different for everybody, because if you're in a boat versus a kayak, then that handles wind and waves differently. If you're on the shore versus, in a vessel period, then yeah, there's a difference in the amount of wind and the amount of waves that you can handle. The water depth is another variable, right? Are you going to get blown into dangerous obstacles like trees or stumps or rocks, or size of water? Like, are you on a big state park lake? Or are you on a large pond or rock quarry type deal. Because to me, a lot of the lakes that I fish, if I'm fishing the quote unquote windblown side, that might only be like 1,000-yard stretch and that's it. I'm on some very tiny lakes a lot of times. That's very different than if you're on Lake Erie, where the quote unquote windblown side might be the size of my county that I live in, right? So there's all kinds of different variables and different situations that go into that as well. But a couple of easy tips here. Number one, face your vessel into the wind. That always helps me. I feel like I can fight it better. I can avoid obstacles better. I'm not going to get blown into shore. For instance, if I'm in a kayak, the worst thing I think I can do is face sideways when it comes to the wind, because it blows you easier. You catch more wind when you're sideways. And if it's kicking up waves and you got, little rollers or small little white caps or something, you want to take those head on, not sideways. Sideways is where problems happen. Also, you can beef up the weights of your lures. That makes it easier to cast in the wind. It's easier to get down in the water when that wind is whipping around, and it's easier to maintain tension and eliminate that dreaded wind bow in your line. So heavier baits seem to help as well. But at the end of the day, it's basic bass biology. The food chain often follows the wind. So as Kevin Baxter said in our 5-year anniversary episode, the wind is your friend. All right, the next question here is from Chester, and he says, "Hi, Andrew, how's it going? I have what I hope is a pretty simple question about the guides on my rods. No matter what rod I buy, the eyelets down the rod always seem to be the first thing to fail me. I can't count how many eyelets or inserts I've lost over the years. Is there anything I can do to help keep this from happening? Thanks and love the show, Chester." Oh boy, we all hate this, right? I'm right there with you, Chester. I've not necessarily damaged a lot of eyelets, even though I have had a few of the footings completely rip off of rods, but a lot of those darn inserts have failed me over the years, where they just pop right out and it drives me absolutely crazy, because now that eyelet is not as smooth as the other eyelets. You've lost that ceramic insert that keeps that smoothness of your line through your entire rod. Eyelets are and always will be the number one reason for rod issues on the planet. They're just the part of the rod with the most give. They're the easiest to break, pretty much regardless of brand or make of that rod. So unfortunately, part of this answer is just going to be, man, it's going to happen sometimes, especially if you're hard on your gear. Now, the other side of this is going to be, obviously, the better you take care of your gear, the longer it's likely to last. So when it comes to guide care, there's a few simple things that you can probably do. One, stop dropping your rods or stop hitting them on things. And this is directed as much at me as it is anybody else. I hit my rods on everything. They are a magnet for hitting anything and everything that is around me at any given time. Without fail, I scrape ceilings, I lean them on my truck, and then 10 seconds later, you hear them crash to the ground, even though they were balanced when I put them up there and we didn't have an earthquake. I don't know why they slid down, but they did slide down. That happens to me all the time, and boom, they hit the concrete or they hit the gravel or whatever. I hit them on my back cast, in my kayak, all of the above. We're all human. It happens to all of us all the time. So it's easier said than done, but number one would be stop dropping your rods, stop hitting your rods on things. That will help. Number two, I would say use rod sleeves for transportation. Simple enough, but effective. Rod sleeves probably protect guides more than anything else on that rod. They're cheap, they're simple, and they work. Number three, I would probably say, is keep them clean. Keep those eyelets clean. Don't let corrosion or mud or grime or rust be the reason that they fail. Clean them often. A little bit of water, a little bit of Dawn dish soap or all-purpose cleaner, Windex, WD-40. I've literally used everything. Now, some rod manufacturer might be listening to this and you can tell me why it's bad to use one of those if one of those is not good for your rods, but I've used them all. I've never had any issues. They've all worked for me fine. Anything to keep those eyelets clean and to hopefully prolong their life expectancy. And then number four, I'm going to say it's a hard one around here, but something that I've found to be detrimental to guides is taking them out in the ice. Now, I say that knowing full well that I'm going to do it. I have to. It's cold, the temps are freezing in the wintertime, but I'm still going to go out and fish. So it's going to happen. But I have seen more eyelets have issues after hard days or weeks of fishing in freezing temps than almost anything else. Those eyelets freeze shut, then we're breathing on them, we're spitting on them, dunking them in the water, trying to free that ice off of those eyelets to make another cast. And all of that wear and tear on the eyelets adds up over time. Over a full day, I might mess around with those eyelets 50 to 100 times or more to try and unfreeze them so that I can keep fishing by necessity. I know that's not good for them. I'm using my fingers to try and punch that ice out after I've breathed on it for 20 seconds to try and loosen it. Pushing and refreezing that ice all the time on those inserts can't be good for them in the long run. You've got that expanding of the ice on there, and then you've got you trying to melt it every 2 seconds so you can cast again. Just can't be good for them. So there's a few things that you can do, but again, at the end of the day, at one time or another, we're always going to have eyelet issues. It's just going to be a part of the game when it comes to rods. Okay, and the last question here is from Keenan, and he says, howdy to you, Andrew, and the whole Tackle Talk gang from Central Texas. I have a question about the Bassmaster Classic. I know from listening to the show that you've attended the Classic to cover it for the show, thank you, by the way, for the past 2 years. With the Bassmaster Classic coming to my neck of the woods in 2025, I'm planning on attending for the first time. My question is, what should I expect and what should I make sure to attend versus the things that are lame or not worth my time? I'm asking because I feel like you'll shoot me straight and hopefully save me from wasting my time or missing some of the best parts. Thanks, and look forward to seeing you down here in the spring, Keenan. Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, so I'm not a Bassmaster Classic veteran by any means. Like you said, I've only been to 2 of them, but my top, let's go like 3. I'll say my top 3 things that I feel like you have to do would be 1, first and foremost, take a full day or 2 or 3 if you can and go to the expo. If I had like gun to my head to pick one thing to do at the Bassmaster Classic, whether it was expo, weigh-ins, whatever, I would pick the expo. I would rather go to the expo and miss all of the fanfare at the weigh-ins than go to the weigh-ins and miss the expo. Because the expo, for me, like a fish nerd, a tackle lover, it's heaven on earth. And then if you're a fan of the sport, all the pros are around, they're accessible, they're talking at the booths, hanging out, signing autographs, and it's just a fun time to meet your fishing heroes too if you're into that sort of thing. But bring money and buy some cool tackle at the expo, which is like hundreds and hundreds of super cool booths, everything you can imagine, big companies, small companies, rods, reels, baits, line, apparel, coolers, batteries, boats, kayaks, motors, electronics, new releases, old releases, bargain bins. There's everything at the Bassmaster Classic Expo, and it's free. Everything at the Classic weekend, all weekend long, in terms of admission, is free, so you don't have to worry about paying anything to get in. Go in, meet people at these companies, talk to them, put your hands on, hundreds of different rods and reels, things that you wouldn't normally be able to pick up, and go out there and play around with gear. That is probably the most fun part of the Classic to me. Number 2, I would say go to the final day of weigh-in. Yeah, day 1 and 2 are cool because you get to see more anglers on stage before they're eliminated, but the final day is where the magic happens. And my favorite moment of the whole thing is not even like the final announcement or the trophy handoff or the confetti with the boat ride around the arena. It's the Super 6. The top 6 anglers from day 2 are honored with the coolest, like goosebump-inducing high production video as they're each introduced and brought on stage for that final day. And the 2 years that I've been, it's literally made the hair on the back of my neck stand up watching that Super 6 video. And it's different every year. A very, very well-produced piece of the Bassmaster Classic weekend from the Bassmaster crew. So it's that cool. That would be on my checklist for sure. Go to the final day weigh-in. And then number 3, if you can, I would go see a blast off on the water one of the mornings. And for this one, it's actually better to probably go like the first day because you get to see everybody. There's no, winners or losers yet. No one knows who's going to do well, who's not going to do well. You get to watch these guys go right beside you in their boats, fully rigged out, wide-eyed and hungry for the biggest title in the bass fishing world. So not a deal breaker if you can't go to the blast off, especially because it usually takes quite a bit of travel to go there unless you get a cool setup setup like Knoxville a couple years ago, where the takeoff was literally like a couple blocks away from the expo and from the weigh-in and all of that. That was a really cool setup. Usually you got to drive a little bit to go to the takeoff one of those mornings, but if you can, I think it's worth it too. So those would be my 3 things. Spend the majority of your time at the expo, attend the final weigh-in day to see the Super 6, and see one of the morning launches if you can. To me, those are my 3 favorite parts of the Bassmaster Classic weekend. All right, everybody, that is today's episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I appreciate you all. As always, go find us on the internet, tackletalkpodcast.com. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, YouTube, at Tackle Talk Podcast. Shoot us an email, tackletalkpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.
Thank you for listening to the Tackle Talk Podcast. Tackle Talk is produced by Andrew Hayes. Copyright 2021. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.